So in this video, we're going to be going through the basics of implementing a simple table view and collection view. So if you remember from the hack shop, we were going through the implementation of a basic CEO jokes app, which we can see here. So this is roughly what we're going to be doing today in this video. You can see here there's a collection view where you can see every CEO with their picture, their name, a joke, and also a button that takes you to a list of products. So if we were to click on this button, we'll see we see a list of all the Apple products with the company name on the side. It's a pretty simple project, but it's just going to take you through the basics of how you would go about doing both a collection view and a table view. So let's go ahead and get started. So I've started with a basic starter file here. I laid out the basic navigation for this. So we have inside of a navigation controller, we have one screen for the collection view and one for the table view. And clicking on a cell here will lead us to the products page. So let's just get started. First thing I'm going to do is to drag out a simple collection view. And we're going to put it right at the very top corner, including at the top of the navigation bar, and drag it to fill up the entire screen. And we could just set the constraints for all of this, like for the left, top, right, and bottom. But in a really simple situation like this, it might just be easier to add missing constraints, and that will automatically take care of it for us. So now let's go into this. If you see right here, there's a little cell that's already opened up for us. And this is basically a prototype cell where we can set the design that we want to create. So I'm going to make this a little bit bigger and have it fill up the screen like this. Roughly this size should be good. So what are all the things that we need here? Within the screen, we saw a picture, 2 different labels, and a button. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's start with an image view. And we'll have it take up a square shape, but about this much space. This should be good. And then we need labels. One for the name, and we'll have it just a little bit offset from the edge of the button, or of the image. And one here as well. And lastly, we need a button that we can click on to go to the product screen, which we'll do right here, and we'll have this take up the entire width. So now we need to set some constraints really quick here. So for the image view, I'm going to have it hug the left and top sides of the cell. I'm also going to keep it fixed in width and aspect ratio. So this should be roughly 1:1. For the label, I'm going to have it do horizontal spacing from the image view as well as top space to the top of the cell. And this, I'm going to set it to be the same as the left leading edge of this label. Also the vertical spacing. And really quick, I want to make this fill up a bigger space because this will end up being a pretty big label because of the multiple lines. So I'm going to set this also on the right edge. For the button, we can set a couple of constraints as well. The leading edge, trailing, bottom, and also one from the bottom of the image view. And that should be good to get us going. We can do a couple more things with this, just set some UI properties just to make this look a lot nicer. So first things first, let's try setting a couple properties of button. This is going to be consistent across every cell, so we can just set the text for this right here. I'll call this products. And we want to make this look a little bit nice because right now it's just the default settings. So I'll choose a color for this. I think this one looks good. And I'll set the text also to white so that we don't have overlapping colors. This label is good, but this one, I want to make this text a little bit smaller just because it'll be difficult to fix all of the text within the screen if it's this big. So I'll make the size 12. A couple other things I can do. I can make the line break here word wrap so that if there's multiple lines it ends up going. And we actually need to set that this can be multiple lines. So I'm going to set the line property from 1 and I'm going to make it go up to, I think 4 should be good. Okay, and that sets most of the layout stuff here. There's a few more things we can do to make this look nicer. One thing I'm going to do is with this button, if we go to the identity inspector, we'll see right here there's a section called user defined runtime attributes. And what that means is we can set properties of this button that aren't actually done before compiling, but actually just calculated straight at runtime. So a couple things I can do. If I want to make this, rather than being just a regular rectangle, I can make it rounded by doing layer.cornerRadius and setting that to a number, which would be, let's say 5. I think I'll do the same with the entire cell as well. Layer.cornerRadius, again a number, and we'll set it to 5. Great. Last thing I want to do here, we'll notice that this cell is exactly the same as the background color, so we won't see any distinction between the two. So what I want to do here is to take the cell, I'll set the color of this just to white, but with the collection view entirely, I want to set a background color that is a little bit different so that we can just see the distinction between the two. So in the attributes inspector, I'm going to change it from white color to a very subtle shade of blue, just like a light bluish color that we can make out the difference between the two. We'll also notice that there's no gap between the navigation bar and the very first cell. So one more thing that we want to take care of really quick is if we go to the size inspector, we can set something called a section inset. And that will just create a gap between the very top of the collection view and the cell. So this should be enough in terms of setting the layout. I think this should be pretty good overall. So with this all done, we can go ahead and take care of some of the programmatic stuff. I made a couple of view controllers here for handling these view controllers themselves, but because this is a custom cell, if we want to refer to the properties of this cell, we need to create a class for this as well. So I'll make a new file, a Cocoa Touch class, and we'll make sure that this is a subclass of UI collection view cell. So let's go ahead and call this jokes collection view cell. Okay, and now we can go back to the storyboard. We can set the class for this cell to jokes collection view cell. And now if we open the assistant editor here with the 2 circles, we can go into the code and open up the collection view cell file and drag out some outlets for these. So for the image, we'll call this image view. I'll take this label, we'll call it username. We'll make one for post, and lastly one for product or for the button. Great, and that's actually all we need to do to that file. Now we're able to reference these whenever we need to. So with all of this done, we can go into the jokes view controller and start editing the actual collection view. So we haven't actually created a property for the collection or a reference for the collection view yet. So first thing we need to do here is if we click here, we can actually go to the entire collection view and create an outlet for this as well. And we can just drag this outlet into the view controller, and we'll call this collection view. Now that we have all the references done, first thing we need to take care of is actually finding a way to create references to the data itself. So we need some way of accessing the data. If you remember from the hack shop, what we did was basically create 3 different arrays for username, posts, and for images. And that's fine, that will work, but it's a little bit awkward to have to reference 3 different arrays when they typically refer to basically the same thing. So I'm going to introduce you guys to something that's a little bit unique about Swift. This is a Swift-defined data structure that's actually really useful, and it's called a struct. And in this scenario, we're going to basically be treating this as like a little class of its own, just to represent every CEO and what kind of properties that they contain. So I'll create a struct and I'll call it CEO object. And let's think about this. So every CEO has a name, a joke, a picture, and here they also have a list of products in their company. So those are the 5 variables that we need to create references for. So I'm going to make username, make it a string. We'll make post a string. We'll make profile picture a UI image. We'll make product array a string array. And lastly, company will be a string. And that's actually all we need here. This will just basically allow us to reference CEOs in terms of their properties whenever we need to, rather than having independent arrays. So in terms of actually filling this, we first of all need an actual array of these CEO objects. So I'm going to make a CEO array. This type is CEO objects, and I'll initialize it to an empty one right now. To fill this, I actually have a little bit of code here that I can copy in. We can fill this by appending to the CEO array and creating objects for each one. And when you create a struct or a new struct object, you have to pass in all of the parameters for each variable. And I think this is complaining because I put the profile picture after the post. And that should be good to fix all of this. So now we have 5 different objects that we can insert into this array, and we'll be able to do stuff with this as we please. So now with the collection view, we can actually start populating this with data. First thing we need to do, if you remember, was to set the jokes view controller not only to a UI view controller, but we can also set it to be a UI collection view delegate and a UI collection view data source. And what this means is we're saying that this view controller will basically implement certain functions that we need to set both the layout and the data for the collection view that we're using. And right now this will be complaining because we haven't actually implemented these functions yet. So let's try out a couple of these functions. There's actually only 2 that we really need to be able to run this code. And that's, first of all, specifying the number of cells that we actually need to create. So we can do that. I'm just going to use the code completion here. Number of items in section is the function that we use to specify how many items we're actually going to have. And typically collection views can be broken into sections, but here we only have just one, so we don't need to worry about that. So the number of items in the section is going to correspond to the number of items that are in our CEO array. So we can just return CEO array.count. And now for the other function that we need for every cell to specify the properties that are actually going to make it up. So that we can do using cell for item at index path. And there's a couple things you have to do here. So this basically generates a cell object and then returns it, given all the properties that we need. So first of all, we have to create a cell. So I'm going to say let cell equal. And this is a bit of a hefty bit of code, but we need to specify that we're going to create a cell based on a certain identifier. And so every cell, if you go back to the storyboard, this cell can be set with a particular identifier that we use to refer to it whenever we need to within the code itself. So right now we don't have an identifier yet, but I'm going to go ahead and call this CEO cell. And then we'll be able to reference it within the code as well. And that will basically give us this kind of cell. So let's go back here, and then we'll pass in CEO cell for index path. And index path basically means not just a single index as an integer, but referring to both the section and the item corresponding to the collection view. So here it could be things like section 0, row 1, or section 0, row 2, and so on. And because this function returns a UI collection view cell, we actually need to cast this to a jokes collection view cell because that will allow us to reference the properties we need. So I'm going to say as jokes collection view cell. And now we can set properties for this. So if you remember, we had properties like username, and we can set the text of that to be CEO array of indexpath.item dot username. And we can do the same thing with everything else as well. Image view dot image equals CEO array indexpath.item dot profile picture. Oops. Then we can set the post.text to be CEO array of indexpath.item dot post. And this is pretty much all we need. Let's ignore the button for right now and come back to that. But right now I'm going to go ahead and return the cell because, again, this function does return a UI collection view cell. So that's all we need right here. These are the 2 functions that we need to implement to actually be able to run this, and that should work fine. The last thing we need to take care of is we haven't actually specified that this collection view should be searching for these 2 particular functions when it's actually loading up the data. So what we need to do next is to tell the collection view that the stuff that it's looking for can be found within this view controller itself. So we're going to say collection view.delegate equals self, and same thing for the data source. And that should be good. So if we were to go ahead and run this, we should be able to populate this with all of the data. So how does this look? Yep, we have 5 different cells. All of them have the corresponding jokes for every CEO as well as all the other things. And you can also notice that there's a slight difference between the background and the cell itself, as well as the inset at the top. So this is pretty much good to go. All the layout is done for this, and we have a collection view that works. So now one thing you'll notice is that this button doesn't do anything yet. And so we're going to go ahead and work on implementing this in the table view as well. So let's move on to that. So if you remember, the table view was taken care of in this class, which is a products view controller. And I want to do something here, which is to, instead of using Storyboard to lay out the properties for this, I'm actually going to do this entirely programmatically, just to give you guys some experience with programmatic UI as well. And it's pretty simple, actually. Most of it correlates exactly the same to what we did, but we're just not going to edit the Storyboard file for this. So there's a couple things we're going to do first. First of all, let's create a new table view. We'll say var table view, UI table view. And what we want to do is to create this table view, first thing we need to position the table view within the screen itself. So we're going to create the table view and pass in a frame. And the frame basically tells us what the X and Y position as well as the width and height are for this table view. So we can pass in a CG rect object, which takes in X, Y, width, and height. We want it to start at the origin, so we'll pass it 0, 0. And then the width will be the width of the screen, basically, right? So it's going to be view.frame.width. And view.frame basically corresponds to the frame of the main view on the screen itself. And we can do the same for view.frame.height. And now lastly, we also need to add this to the view itself. So we have to call view.addSubview, table view, and that's basically just going to allow us to put this on top of the existing screen. A couple more things we need to do. Again, we need to set this to be a UI table view delegate and UI table view data source. And again, we need to set the table view.delegate to self and table view.data source equals self. Okay, what's next? Let's ignore the table view functions for now and come back to that. One thing we haven't talked about is what the actual cells of the table view will look like. And since we're not doing Storyboard, the way we're going to do that is basically, I'm going to create a new class right here. And we could make a new file for this if we wanted, but this is going to be pretty small, so I'll just create it at the bottom here. And I'll call this products table view cell. And this is going to be a UI table view cell. Now, we had 2 properties of the cell, which was the product and also the company. So we'll make var product label, and we'll call this UI label. And then var company is the UI label as well. Okay. What's next? So how are we actually getting the product and company the products and company names from the previous view controllers? So when we click on the button within the screen, we'll be able to pass data as we segue and set properties for this entire class itself. So what we're going to do here is make an array of products and also a company string. And we'll set that when we do the segue itself. Now what we want to do here with the product table view cell is to set the layout for this. So we've created these 2 labels, but we haven't decided where we actually want to put them. And what we want to do is to use a built-in function that table view cells provide called awake from nib. And this is basically called as soon as the table view cell starts loading and when you're basically bringing it into the view. So what we're going to do is when this function is called, we're going to start setting the properties for the product label and company label. And I'm going to do 2 different things here. So if you remember, we talked about 2 different strategies for programmatic UI. One is using frames like we did with the table view right here. And one is also using just constraints, basically the same way as we do on Storyboard, but instead programmatically. So let me start with the product label, and I'll do this using a frame, which tends to be a little bit easier for some people usually. So I'm going to say product label equals UI label, and I'm going to pass in a frame. So we want this to be just a little bit off from the left edge of the cell. So I'll say about 10 from the left. And we want this to take up, basically take up about half of the cell, but be centered on the y anchor. So I'm going to start at about a fourth of the way and end at about 3/4 of the way. So I'll do frame.height times 0.25. The width of this could be, I think about 100 should be fine for small labels. And then the height is going to be frame.height over 2. So this should fill up the middle of the cell. Next thing we want to do is add this to the subview, or add this as a subview to the cell view. And that's actually all we need to do there. Pretty easy stuff. It'll be a little bit more complicated when we do constraints because we have to specify the actual positions of all of them relative to something else, but it is a little bit more precise when you think about it, and it just makes more sense to some people. So let's do this with the company label. Let's create a UI label. Don't need to pass in a frame or anything. We need to set a couple of things for this. So first thing we need to do is to say we need to pass in this line, translates auto resizing mask into constraints, and we need to set this to false. And what this basically does is it says we're going to take care of the constraints ourselves. We don't want the program to basically create its own constraints and take care of this for us. Like, this is basically going to be handled by us using our own constraints. So I'll add this as a subview as well. And now we need to actually set the constraint for it. And you have to make sure that you don't set the constraints until after it's been added as a subview, because then it won't understand what it's actually trying to be constrained to. So two things we want to do. We want to make it hug the right side of the cell and also be centered on the Y, right? So let's do this. Let's say company right equals company label dot right anchor dot constraint equal to, and we want it to be equal to the right anchor of the cell itself, but offset by a constant of about 10. Next thing we want to do is set this to be centered vertically. So we can say company center Y equals company label dot center Y anchor dot constraint, and we want this to be exactly equal to the center Y anchor of the view. And now once we have those done, we can activate these constraints by calling the function NSLayoutConstraint dot activate, and then we pass in an array of constraints. So we'll pass in company right and company center Y. And that's all we need to do. These constraints will activate, and now we have two different labels that we've positioned where we need to. And that's basically all we need to do with this cell. So now let's take care of some of the TableView stuff. We need to implement the two functions, number of rows in section, or number of rows in section. So this is different from CollectionView where we said number of items. Typically a TableView is listed in terms of rows because it's more list-like. CollectionView is called items instead, but basically represents the same thing. So in this case, we'll return product array.count. And then the other function is solve for row at index path. And we do something similar here. So we need to say let self equal TableView.dequeue reusable cell. I'm going to have this one. And last time with the identifier, we did it through the storyboard. So what do we do here? In this case, we actually need to do this by calling a function called register, which in the table view will basically take the class that we created here and create some sort of identification for it so that we can reference it again. So we're going to say TableView.register, and we're going to pass in products TableViewCell.self, meaning the class, and we're going to give it an identifier, which we'll say is product cell. So here again, we can reference product cell, and that will give us the same class that we were referring to, and we'll pass an index path again. And again, we can cast this to products TableView cell. Great. So now, how do we want to set the properties? Well, first we actually have to make sure that this function is called, right? So we're going to say cell.awakefromNib. And I'm going to do something here which is a little bit different. In the last case with the collection view, we set the properties here within this function as well. But it's a little bit more memory efficient to use a different function for these properties. So right now I'm just going to return the cell, and we're going to make a new function called willDisplay. It should be willDisplayCell, And this is basically called as soon as the cell is about to be brought into view and you're about to see it. And this is where we want to populate the actual information into the cells. So we get a cell as a UI table view cell object, but we first want to make sure that this is a products table view cell. So I'm going to say let cell equal cell as products table view. And now we can set these properties. So cell.productLabel.text will set equal to product array of index path dot row. And again, for the company label.text, we can set equal to company. And that should be everything. So we have these functions set, but there's still one thing we're missing. We haven't actually passed in any data here with a segue. So the last thing that we need to take care of right here is to go into our jokes view controller and create some sort of action event for when the cell button is pressed. So what I'm going to do is go to the cell dot button, and I'm going to add a target for it. And so we need to make a function that will get called as soon as the button is pressed, right? So let's create a function. We'll say did go to products. And I'll pass in a sender, which will be a UI button, which basically means this function is called by a UI button. So right here with the target, we'll say the target is self. And the syntax for calling a selector in Swift 3 is to do hashtag selector and then list the name of the function. And we're going to say this event is on touch-up inside, and in Swift 3 it's actually lowercase t. Great, so now as soon as this button is pressed, this function will get called. And what do we want to do? We want to do a segue. So let's start by doing the perform segue function. So we'll do self.perform segue with identifier. And I called it to products, I think, in the storyboard. Let's check. Yeah, to products. And in the sender, we normally pass in self as the parameter for sender, but there's a reason I'm not going to do that right now. And let me just do this really quick. I'm going to pass in the same sender for the segue, and I'll show you why. So when we do the prepare for segue function call, we need some way of identifying the fact that this particular cell was clicked on, this button, because all of these buttons will go to the same function, but we don't know which button was which, right? So we want to know which button was actually called. And so there's a couple of things that we can do. If we go back here, within the self-arrival index path function, we can set a property of the button called tag. And the tag is basically an int that we can use to refer to some sort of index for this. So we're going to set the button's tag to be indexPath.item. So now we have a way of knowing that this button corresponds to this particular index path. So now, if we go into prepare for segue, first thing we'll do is say if segue.identifier equals to products. Now, we know that the sender is a button, so I'm going to cast the sender to the UI button. And I'm also going to get the destination view controller from the segue. And now what do we want to do? We want to set certain properties for the product view controller, right? So we're going to say product VC dot product array, and we're going to set it equal to CEO array of sender dot tag dot product array. And what that does is say go into the particular index of the CEO array which corresponds to this button and access that product array. And we can do the same thing for the company. And that should be all we need to do with that. So now the data will be passed between the jokes view controller and the products view controller, and we can see how this works. So let's try running this. Okay, so this still works. Collection view loads data as normal. Now what happens if we click on them? Great, so we clicked on the button and it took us to the screen where we see Steve Jobs, all of the Apple products corresponding to a particular company. If we click on Mark Zuckerberg, we'll see all of these. Elon Musk, we'll see all of these. Great, so this works fine. And that's pretty much it. That's all the basics. There's a couple of other functions that you can call as well, table views and collection views. If you wanted to make every table view a lot bigger and specify the size, you could call height for row at index path, and that would be one function you could call. The equivalent of this for a collection view is to do size for item at index path. One thing that I want to go over really quick was, if we go back to the collection view, we'll notice that nothing happens when you actually click on a cell, right? In the case of a table view, if you click on one, it will highlight it. One thing that's really annoying, I think, when this happens is that if you click on it, it will stay highlighted and nothing will change. So let's try changing this to make it so that when you click on it, we'll also get rid of the highlighting. So we'll add one more function to the table view, did select row at index path. And this is basically called as soon as a particular row of the table view is clicked on. And what we can do now is, if we want to get rid of the selecting, we can also say TableView dot deselect at the same index path, and we can animate it if we want. I'll just say false for now. So now if we click on these, they'll automatically deselect as soon as we let go. And that's it. That's basically the entire implementation of CollectionView and TableView. Hopefully this helps you guys. This should definitely help in terms of the mini projects. So if you get stuck on anything, let us know, or check out this video for more help. Great. Thanks, guys.